Well, I want to begin this morning by showing you what I think is, without a doubt, at least in my mind, the best description of what 2020 has been like so far this year. Would you all agree that that's pretty good description, right? I mean, I know that I actually began to work on this sermon. Did most of the work on this message a couple of weeks ago because I knew we were going to be out of town this week on vacation. And back when I was working on this message, here's some of the headlines that we were dealing with at that time. We had in Seattle, we had a group of people who had basically taken over 6 blocks of the city, and that one was really relevant to Mary and I because until we actually canceled the vacation that we had planned, we would have been in Seattle while all that was going on. So that was kind of relevant for us. We know the Bighorn fire up here in the Catalinas, it was wreaking havoc. It was burning out of control. There were people who had to be evacuated from their homes. So that was going on. Here in Arizona, we had COVID cases that were really increasing rapidly. The hospitalizations were increasing rapidly, and that was going on. And so we had all these things going on, and frankly, over the last week, nothing's gotten any better, has it? And when we look at those things like that in our world, it's real easy to look at those and to begin to ask questions and to have doubts about God and to begin to think that life isn't fair. And even to perhaps to fear the future and what we have before us. And that's kind of a natural thing for us. And that's why we've been looking at the book of Habakkuk, because Habakkuk went through exactly those same things. He had those same kind of thoughts. He lived in a time when the people of Judah, after King Josiah died, he was a good king, the people had turned away from God. And the nation of Judah was experiencing violence, it was experiencing chaos, really not unlike what we're seeing in our country today as people turn away from God here. And so what Habakkuk does, he comes and he brings those doubts, he brings his fears before God, and he has this conversation with God. He's unlike any other prophet in that respect because he actually begins to ask God questions, and God gives him answers. And he basically says to God, God, why aren't you doing something? And God comes back and says, you know what, Habakkuk, I am doing something. He says, as a matter of fact, here's what's going on. I'm raising up the Babylonians who are wicked and who are vicious, and I'm going to use them to come in, and I'm going to use them to judge my own people. And he said, then when I get done with them, I'm going to judge them too. And as we get to the end of Habakkuk chapter 2, we begin to get some hints about how Habakkuk is going to actually respond to what God has told him. Here's the last verse in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 20. It says, here's what Habakkuk says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And so here's what he says. He's basically saying, you know what, God? I may not like this, but I trust that you're still on your throne. I'm trusting that you're sovereign. I'm trusting that you're still in control, even though I can't see that with my own eyes. And this morning, we're going to see how Habakkuk responds to all the things that God has told him here in these first 2 chapters. Things that Habakkuk probably really didn't want to hear because they weren't pleasant for him. I mean, as he thought about those things, he had to understand that this wasn't going to be a pretty sight. It wasn't going to be easy for his own people, and it probably wasn't going to be easy for him either. And so this morning we're going to pick up in chapter 3. But before we do this, I want to kind of give you what the big idea is here this morning, because I think it's really clear what the big idea is from this book this morning, and here it is. When you walk with Jesus through enough yesterdays, you'll be able to trust him with all your tomorrows. That's what we're going to see this morning, that Habakkuk learned this lesson. He learned that because he had walked through all these yesterdays with God, that he was able to trust God with the tomorrows. Even when those things just seemed like, man, they were going to be horrible and hard and everything like that. And that's what I want us to see this morning. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Habakkuk chapter 3. Again, like we say every week, don't feel ashamed to use your table of contents. I have to do that sometimes too with these little prophets in here. So let's go ahead and look at this here. Habakkuk chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to the Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years revive it, in the midst of the years make it known, in wrath remember mercy. So we see here that there's this prayer that Habakkuk has, and really it's actually more of almost like a psalm, isn't it? He starts out here and he talks about it's according to the Shigionoth, which is probably a musical term. We'll see when we get to the end of the chapter, he's going to talk about the fact that this prayer is to be prayed with stringed instruments. And not only that, we find the word Selah in there. It's kind of an untranslatable word. You know, the only other place we find that in the Bible is in the Psalms. And we don't know exactly what it means, but we're pretty sure it's actually a time to pause and to reflect on the things that God is saying. And we're going to see that he actually does that as he prays this prayer. And as he begins this prayer, he talks about, God, would you revive it? And as I was thinking about that, what he's really praying is something that's really similar to one of the songs that we sing frequently here at Thornydale Family Church, a song called Do It Again. And it says, that's the words to the chorus say, I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe that I'll see you do it again. You make a way where there was no way, and I believe that you'll do it again. And that's exactly what Habakkuk is saying here. He says, God, I've seen you work in the past, and I believe that you're going to do it again. And in a moment, as we look at the rest of the chapter, we're going to see that what Habakkuk does is he looks back upon all the things that God has done in the past. He looks back at God's past faithfulness. And he says, God, I know because you've been faithful in the past that I can trust you with my future. But before he does that, he prays one more thing. He prays at the end of this section, he says, in wrath, remember mercy. In wrath, remember mercy. And I think that's such an appropriate prayer for us today, too, isn't it? I mean, we want God's wrath poured out, not on us. We'd like to see it poured out on everyone else, right? But we don't want to see it. We want God to treat us with mercy. And that's really a prayer that had been appropriate all the way back to the garden. When Adam and Eve sinned, they deserved God's wrath. But beginning then, God treats them with mercy. And he had treated the people of Israel with mercy all throughout their history. They kept turning away from God, and God says, you deserve my wrath, but I'm going to treat you with my mercy. And had God not done that, he would not have been able to keep the promise that he'd made to Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12 when he said, I'm going to make you and your descendants into this great nation. And I'm going to bless all the nations of the world through you and through your descendants. And so God had consistently done that. He had consistently treated his people with mercy. And Habakkuk, as he's praying, he's saying, God, would you please do that again? He says, I know you're going to bring wrath, but would you please bring your mercy too? Now in the next section, we're going to see that there are actually two different, probably some epic songs that have been passed down through the nation of Israel over the years. We'll see some hints of that there, and we'll see some hints that they are actually two different things, but they're both focusing on the same thing. They're focusing on the salvation of God. They're focusing on how God brought his people out of bondage and slavery in Egypt and brought them into the promised land. And as we look at them, I think you'll be able to see why we can pick out, even in English, that there's actually two different songs here, even though they're focusing on the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up in verse 3 with the first of those, and that'll go all the way through verse 7. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Selah. There's that time to kind of pause and reflect here. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hands, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. So we see here some things about this first song. He focuses here on God and what he did, but he does it in the third person. You'll notice here, he refers to God to him and to his. And so he's looking at God, and he's focusing here primarily on God's glory. He talks about the light and probably thinking all the way back to when God gave the law there on Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up on the hill and he sees just a glimpse of God's glory there. And he also talks here about God's power and about the power that was exercised in the plagues that he brought against Egypt, that he used to free his people from bondage and from slavery there. And so we see this picture of him focusing there on God's glory, on his power, on his might. As we get into the next song, we're going to see that there's a little different focus there. So if you go ahead, I'll continue in verse 8 here. And you'll see a difference right away. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea? When you rode on your horses on your chariot of salvation, you stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. Selah. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. Selah. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. So you'll notice right away here there's a change, isn't there? He no longer speaks of God in the third person, his and him. He now speaks to him more personally in the second person, you and your. And while he's still focusing on God's glory, and he's still focusing on God's power, there's a little different focus here. He's focusing on these miraculous acts that God did in order to free his people. And he's also focusing here on the wrath that God poured out on the enemies of Israel over all these years, and how God had poured out the wrath on those enemies. He also, you'll notice here, he focuses on salvation. And that's a really interesting word. The Hebrew word that's used there is actually a form of Yeshua, which is the Hebrew name for Jesus. And so we see a picture of Jesus all the way back here in the book of Habakkuk as he talks about how God's going to bring salvation to his people. So with these two epic songs that he cites here, we see him focusing on all the things that God has done in the past. And that's just setting the stage now for how he's going to express his faith in what God's going to do in the future. But before we get to that, I want to look at one more verse that shows something important about how Habakkuk responds to God here. Look at verse 16. He says this, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. Here's how I kind of picture Habakkuk, and it's not surprising. He reflects back on God's power and upon God's wrath that he's poured out on Israel's enemies. And it says there that he trembles. And isn't that what we see almost every time that someone in the Bible is exposed to God and who he is and gets just a glimpse of God's glory? What do? They tremble. They fear God. We see it with Isaiah. We see it in Revelation. every time we see with Moses, that there's this fear of God here. And he says, yeah, God, I am trembling before you. But then he says something really interesting. He says, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, God, I get it. I know this is going to be tough. I know that this is going to be difficult for my people. I'm going to probably see some of my friends die. I might even die myself when the Babylonians come in. He says, I know you've promised that one day they will get theirs. And I'm just going to sit back and I'm going to wait for that. And you know what? Habakkuk probably never saw that. The Babylonians didn't really get theirs, so to speak, for another 70 years past the time that Habakkuk is writing here. And yet he says, you know what, God, I don't care. I'm going to wait faithfully. I've seen what you've done in the past. I know that I can trust you to do the same thing in the future. I can count on you because I've walked through all these yesterdays with you. I can count on you to get me through my tomorrows. And that brings us to the final section here in Habakkuk that we close with this morning. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. In other words, if things just completely go south, yet, and here's the important part, I will rejoice in the Lord. That word rejoice there literally means to jump with joy. He says, I will take joy in the God of my salvation. That take joy, it means to spin around with joy for God. God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And then it ends to the choir master with string instruments. And so we see here for Habakkuk, it's not just a matter of, I will reluctantly rejoice in God. He says, I'm going to rejoice in God with all I am. I don't care what's going to happen. I can trust God. I've seen the way that He works before, so I can trust Him again. Or as we said this morning, when you walk with Jesus through enough yesterdays, you will be able to trust Him with all your tomorrows. So let me ask you a question this morning. I think it's a really important question. Do you trust God with your tomorrows no matter what they bring? Can you do like Habakkuk and say, you know what, God? Even if my 401k or my IRA, even if the stock market crashes and I lose every penny that I have in my IRAs, I will still rejoice in the Lord. Can you say to God, God, you know what? Even if I lose my job, even if my unemployment runs out, I will choose to rejoice in God. Can you say that even if the chaos in this world gets out of control and my business or my house is burned to the ground, I will rejoice in God? Can you say today that if someone I love gets COVID and they die from that, I will still rejoice in God? That's what Habakkuk was facing there. And he chose to rejoice in God. Now, in a moment, I want to share with you how it is that we can trust God with our tomorrows. But before I do that, I want to share something that God just put on my heart this morning. This was not part of my original message. But as I prayed through the sermon again this morning, this is something that God just really laid upon my heart. Perhaps you've heard a lot of the talk over the last several months about, how that as Christians that we're not to live in fear. And that's certainly true. Absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that we're not to take prudent steps in our lives to prevent things that we can prevent. It doesn't mean that we're not to do things to protect our families and our community. Those things are not living in fear. Think about it. We do those things every day, don't we? When you get in your car, what's the first thing you do? You put on your seatbelt. Does that mean you're living in fear? No. When you pull out of the parking lot here after church is over today, I would suggest that you look both ways before you pull out onto Thornydale. There's probably a car coming. And we don't do that because we're living in fear. We do it because it's a prudent thing to do. When you leave your house, do you lock your door? Do you do that because you're living in fear, or do you do it because it's a prudent thing to do? And I could go on and on and on. And the Bible is full of examples of people in the Bible who did prudent things to protect themselves from harm when they had the power and the ability to do that. And so, yes, as a church, we have chosen to take these measures to protect each other and to protect our community. That does not mean we're living in fear. I mean, think about the biblical examples. I can give you just a few off the top of my head. I think about David. When Saul is after him trying to kill him, does David just go in, "Here I am, Saul. I'm counting on God to protect me"? No, he flees. He runs away. He makes sure that he gets somewhere where he can be safe for a while. Think about the people of Israel during the time of Nehemiah when they're rebuilding the walls, and it says that there were enemies who were coming after them, and it says that they prayed, but they also did something else. They posted a guard, and they worked with their swords on their side. They did that they took prudent action. Or I think about Paul. When Paul is about to be killed in one of the cities, what do? They let him out through a bucket, through a hole in the city wall, and he gets out of there. He doesn't just sit there and say, "Well, God will protect me." Even Jesus, when they tried to kill him before it was his time, what does he do? He leaves that place and he takes prudent action. So what I'm not saying this morning is that we just blindly trust God and do stupid things. That's not what Habakkuk is teaching us. But he is teaching us that we can trust that God will be with us, and God will protect us, and God will take us through these difficult things because he's done that with our yesterdays. He'll take care of our tomorrows. So with that in mind, let me share just a few things that I think we can do to make sure that we really trust God with our tomorrows. Here's the first thing that we need to do. We need to bring our doubts and our fears to God. We've talked about this. I'm not going to really go on and on about this because we've talked about this the last couple of weeks. That's what Habakkuk does. I mean, it's not wrong to get someone else to help you. It's not wrong to take these things to someone else. But before we go whining and complaining and everything else, the first thing we ought to do is to take our doubts and our fears to God. The second thing that we need to do is we need to remember what God has done before. And there's really two ways I think that we can do that. Probably more than that, but two particular ways. The first is we got to spend time in His Word. As we read the Bible, what do we find? Time after time we go back and we read about how God has been faithful to His people over thousands and thousands of years, and that should encourage us. But we also need to look back in our own personal lives and maybe even have some markers in our lives that help us to remember how God's been faithful in our personal lives. You know, that's why I'm convinced that God gives us ordinances like baptism and the Lord's Supper. They're these physical representations of what God has done in our life that help us to look back and to remember those things. I think it's also a great idea, and I know many of you do this, sometimes to keep a journal because you can write down, here's how God answered my prayers. Here's how God has been faithful to me. And you can go back and you can look at that time after time and see what God has done in your life before. The third thing that we need to do is that we need to accept God's answers. Sometimes they're not going to be fun. We've seen this with Habakkuk, haven't we? He finally gets to the point where he says, "You know what, God? I don't like this, but I trust you. I trust that what you're doing is good because you're a good Father," as we sang about before. That based on your character, I know that you're only going to do those things that are ultimately for your glory and for my good. And we just have to accept them even when we don't totally understand them. And then finally, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we choose to trust God with the outcome. That's what Habakkuk did. He says, "You know what? I don't know what's coming, God, but I'll rejoice in you. I'll trust you. I have no idea what's coming down the road." And that the same thing might be true for you this morning. Sometimes we just need to trust God with the outcome. So here's what I want to do as we kind of close our time this morning. I want us to spend some time in prayer, just kind of practically applying the things that we've learned this morning. And I'm going to kind of guide us through this time. I'm going to kind of ask you to pause for a few moments at a time and just to focus your prayer on one aspect of what we're going to do, and then we'll kind of to move on and move through that. So over the next maybe, I don't know how long, we'll just kind of see how God leads. Let's just take some time to pray and to apply these truths this morning. So here's the first thing that I want you to do to pray, is go ahead just to, Ryan, if you can go ahead and, is to admit your questions and your doubts to God. If you do that, just say, God, here's my doubts, here's my questions. I'd be really surprised this morning if there's anyone here who doesn't have any doubts and questions, right? So would you take just a moment? God knows those, so take just a moment to admit those questions and doubts to God. Now you had a few moments to do that. Let's do the second thing that we want to do as we pray together. That you'd commit to accept whatever God's doing. Would you just tell God, God, whatever you're doing through these things, that I choose to accept them regardless of whether I understand them or not. Next thing we want to do as we pray is to thank God for his past faithfulness. Maybe you can think back to some times in your own life when God has been faithful to you, or think of examples from the Scripture and just give him thanks for his faithfulness. And one last thing that we're going to do is just to promise God that you'll rejoice in him regardless of your circumstances. You know, we've seen this morning that when you walk with Jesus through enough yesterdays, that you'll be able to trust Him with all your tomorrows. The thing about Habakkuk is that his circumstances never did change, did they? From the time he began to speak with God, God had a plan in motion. And as Habakkuk prayed, it didn't change his circumstances one bit. The Babylonians were still going to come in. They were going to still overrun Judah. And God was still going to punish them one day. And Habakkuk was going to be right in the middle of all that chaos. So the circumstances didn't change. You know what changed? Habakkuk changed. He changed from the inside out. Because he focused on God's faithfulness with all those yesterdays to the point that he knew he could trust them, trust God with all his tomorrows. And we can do the same. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your faithfulness. Father, as we think about that, we are amazed how faithful you are to us when we have been so unfaithful to you in so many ways, Father. That's true of us as a people, and it's true of us as individuals. And I pray that you would help us just to reflect upon all those yesterdays where you have been faithful to us. And that as we do that, we would truly be able to rejoice in our tomorrows, regardless of the circumstances, that we'd be able to trust you. We ask that in Jesus' name.